There's a certain kind of adult who almost never asks for help. They manage everything themselves. They think ahead. They hold everything together. And from the outside, they look incredibly capable. But spend a little time with them, and you start to notice something quietly underneath all of that. An exhaustion that has no clear source. A kind of loneliness they can't quite name. Here's the thing. That pattern didn't start in adulthood. It started in childhood. And psychology has a very specific name for what happened to them. We often admire children who seem mature for their age. The kid who comforts their crying parent. The teenager who manages the household while their parents struggle. The child who never throws tantrums, never seems needy, never causes trouble. We call them wise. We call them responsible. We call them old souls. But developmental psychology tells a very different story. Because when a child grows up too fast, it isn't wisdom, it's adaptation. And the difference between those two things matters enormously, not just in childhood, but for decades after. Psychologists use the term parentification to describe what happens when a child is placed, consciously or not, in an adult emotional or caretaking role. There are two forms. Instrumental parentification is when a child takes over adult tasks, cooking, managing younger siblings, handling bills. Emotional parentification is when the child becomes a parent's emotional support, the one who listens, who regulates, who holds the parent together. Both have consequences. But emotional parentification in particular leaves a very deep imprint. Here's why. A child's brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex, which handles complex decision-making, emotional regulation, and empathy, is still actively developing well into the mid-20s. When a child is forced to engage that system prematurely, they develop what researchers call hypervigilance. Their nervous system learns to constantly scan their environment for other people's emotional states. Are they happy? Are they upset? What do they need from me? This isn't a conscious choice. It becomes a wired-in, automatic response. The brain essentially learns that safety depends on monitoring others, not on having your own needs met. And here's where it gets really interesting. Because this pattern doesn't stay in childhood. It travels into adulthood in ways that are surprisingly hard to recognize, because they look like strengths. Adults who grew up too fast are often the most reliable people in the room. They're the ones who anticipate problems before anyone else. They're perceptive, emotionally intelligent, incredibly attuned to other people's moods. In relationships and workplaces, they're often described as rock solid, but under the surface, a very different psychological reality is playing out. Research in attachment theory, much of it building on the foundational work of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, shows that children who learn early that their own needs are secondary to others often develop what's called an anxious avoidant attachment pattern. They crave closeness, but they've learned not to depend on it. So they become self-reliant to a degree that actually isolates them. They struggle to ask for help, not because they don't need it, but because somewhere in their early wiring, needing help felt dangerous. It felt like a burden. It felt like too much to ask. And so they learn to manage everything internally, to process their own emotions quietly, to appear unbothered, even when they aren't. There's a fascinating paradox here. These individuals often become exceptional caregivers, deeply empathetic friends, attentive partners, natural nurturers, but they rarely allow themselves to be on the receiving end of that same care. They give easily, they receive awkwardly. And the emotional cost of that imbalance accumulates over time. A 2019 study published in the journal Child Abuse and Neglect found that adults who had experienced emotional parentification in childhood reported significantly higher rates of anxiety, emotional suppression, and chronic people-pleasing behavior. The need to manage others' emotions had essentially overridden the development of their own emotional regulation skills. In neuroscience terms, what happened was a kind of developmental trade-off. The regions of the brain associated with empathy and social monitoring were trained heavily, while the systems associated with self-soothing, internal reflection, and healthy dependency were comparatively underdeveloped. The child became highly skilled at reading the room and very unskilled at simply resting in it. There's also something deeper going on with identity. Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development suggest that childhood is supposed to be a time of exploration, of play, of fantasy, of figuring out who you are, independent of what others need from you. When that space is taken away by adult responsibilities too early, A child doesn't get the chance to fully develop what psychologists call a differentiated self, a sense of who they are when they're not being needed by someone else. So many adults who grew up too fast quietly wrestle with a question they can't quite articulate. Who am I when I'm not taking care of something outside of the role they always occupied? The responsible one, the helper, the mature one. They sometimes feel surprisingly lost. But here's what's important to understand. The adaptations these individuals developed weren't wrong. In the environments they grew up in, those patterns made complete sense. Hypervigilance was protective. Self-reliance was survival. Emotional attunement was how they kept things stable. Psychology isn't about blaming those patterns. It's about recognizing them, understanding where they came from, and noticing when they've outlived the context that created them. Because the same child who learned to survive by never needing anything is now an adult in a world that can actually support them if they'll allow it. The work, for many of these individuals, isn't about becoming less capable or less caring. It's about learning, slowly and often imperfectly, that receiving care is not weakness, that asking for help is not a burden, that somewhere between growing up too fast and never quite feeling like a child, there's still space to rest. And that, perhaps, is where real healing begins.